position that Bybee would typically take is that this very specific information is part of your knowledge of language. It is not just the sort of the possible, but the probable, the most likely. Why is this most likely? Why are you likely to say this? She would like to explain that too. But she goes one step further and says, but that is what is represented in the mind. So it's not just a description of probabilities in the observations. She attributes that to a mental representation of some sort. Another sort of counter-argument to something like X bar, or at least an invitation to say, how do these constraints work? If you look at a typical verb that takes a complement, clausal complements and nominal complements do not have the same possibilities in, let's say, passivization. So they don't behave in similar ways. So that alone does not account for the difference. You need to explain this elsewhere. Now you can say that it's part of the lexicon. If it's part of the lexicon, it's sort of this, the selectional properties of the verb to choose this or that kind of. If we go there, then we're quite close to the constructional analysis that says, well, this verb occurs in this particular construction. Then every verb is its own construction in that version of the lexicon, and then there isn't a big difference between the two approaches. Except the empiricists would argue we get that from our exposure to what the verb actually does in the language we hear, and nativists might argue that there's a stronger infrastructure that supports the judgment to categorize the verb in a particular way.
I just came across an interesting empirical generalization, which sort of relates to this, because it relates to a question about grammatical categories, as opposed to just cognitive categories like verb classes and so on. So this person observes, he tries to make a case, empirically speaking, based on cross-linguistic data, that you can extract a piece out of the complement of a verb. That's something we routinely do, right? When we say, we do believe we should hire, stuff like that, right? But the claim, that's a radical claim, is that you can not, never ever, pull a piece out of a complement to a head of any other category than verb. So one sort of effect of this people have been aware of is the complex noun, for instance, right? So, yeah, who did you discuss the idea we should hire, stuff like that, yeah? But this guy generalizes that across categories and has a very clever way of doing that. So there's something unique about verbs as opposed to all other categories. But it's not about subcategories of verbs. It's sort of black and white, category-wise, right? Category verb is special as opposed to all the others. That's stateable in terms of grammatical categories, right? Because the grammatical category spans all verbs in spite of, any semantic difference between them, right? And I was wondering, what do you think of that? How do you deal with that if you have a system that doesn't even, use syntactic categories? I mean, seen as syntactic categories rather than just, again, cognitive categories, right? Rocks and stuff here and events here, right?
I think the approach would be to say there's something, the verb drives, what we construe as verbs, drives our construal of the world. So we represent events as they unfold in terms of the properties of the events. They link all the various participants together. It's only through construing an event as such that you assign meaningful role to the participants in the event. So that's why verbs are special, because they are the starting point for our construal of the world. And then from there, you say, well, so the category exists in language because it has such a special position in how we understand the world. And so the motivation would be sought not in the linguistic system, but in how we understand the world.
Can I have a rejoinder to that?
Yeah.
Just quick. It's just that nouns too can refer to events, right? Like Mark pointed out. I mean, like, so for example, claim can be either a noun or a verb. In both cases, it seems to sort of roughly mean the same thing. I mean, John made the claim that seems to mean John claimed it, right? Nevertheless, with John made the claim that, you cannot pull anything out of that clause, right? But if you say John claimed that using the verb, you can, right? So it cannot possibly be about what denotes events as opposed to other events. It has to be about syntactic categories.
Yeah, I think so. The attempt to answer that, to address that challenge would be to say, this is where it starts. But once a grammatical category comes into being, once a construction is there, it assumes a certain arbitrary quality. So it may take on properties that it generalizes throughout the category as category. And that's not in principle ruled out. It's just that we won't start with the category given. That is a generalization that emerges from recognizing the category. So the idea of categorization would be our way to get to that.
But what is the nature of those arbitrary properties? I mean, I would be inclined to think that it would have to be something akin to what we tend to call syntactic properties, right? So does that mean that you, after all, sort of recognize that something like a formal syntax has a
properties of its own?
Yeah, it says that what you actually learn, right, on your model will actually eventually turn out to be something fairly similar to, you know, what syntacticians think of as, you know, a syntax with categories with specific syntactic properties.
In that sense, there's of course a lot of diversity among functions. So somebody like Yvonne would be quite happy to take all those properties on board and construct an account, whereas more radical construction grammar would be more resistant to, would try to get out of that kind of analysis as long as possible. So I'm somewhere in the middle, probably closer to, I need a lot of motivation before I accept something. So I'm further from Yvonne and closer to Crofton by the emergence side.
Question to Mark. Did I understand you correctly? Are you saying that modularity means nativism? Or that distinct anatomical faculties in the brain support the idea that the respective thing is made?
No. What do I think? I lost my notes. I've got so many things with here. I think it's, you know, it's kind of convenient that the brain turns out to be this modular thing. But you know, the study of language competence is in principle completely divorced with how those things are implemented in the wet way, if you like. So it's kind of convenient that we can say, look, you know, you poke this area and your eyes flutter. But the brain doesn't have to work like that. So I don't think that a nativist position commits you in any sense to saying that the brain is modular. What I think it commits you to saying, nativist position says, is that the stuff of language must be somewhere in the genes. I think that's really all there is to say. But at the same time, if you look at the brain and it is modular, it kind of lends plausibility to the suggestion that that the brain is not a general learning machine. So the modularity of the brain is more an argument against the general cognitivist perspective than it is against a nativist perspective.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
My limited understanding of minimalism is that it boils down to those three: merge, move, and agree. I agree with agree. I can see why that would be language specific to a certain extent. And to a certain extent, I might be convinced that move is a language specific operation. But why on earth would merge not be a general cognitive principle. I can do lots of merging of other cognitive fields or domains. I can imagine things merging, I can add numbers, I can operate cognitively using merge, putting things together. I can put things together physically, cognitively, in all sorts of domains. So why on earth would you want to make a claim that that's language specific?
I'm not sure I would, actually, in the spirit of rapprochement. So it's merge is not just like lumping stuff together. It's not just creating sets. It's creating a particular kind of set where you get this recursion in. And it is exactly that kind of thing that you expect to be implicated in mathematics, of counting. And it's exactly that kind of thing that you probably expect to be in music or the human sense of rhythm. These are exactly where you expect recursion to happen when you do see recursion. So yeah, we would expect something like merge to be implicated in those things. So at this point, the minimalist program becomes a little bit, less modular, quote unquote, than maybe early Chomsky, right? Because we can start to say, well, there are these things that we can see in other cognitive domains, but they are a very particular kind of cognitive domain, right? And they also have to be the cognitive domains that are uniquely human. And then again, it doesn't undermine the nativist position. All it says is that, that evolutionary thing that made merge possible also simultaneously opened up possibility of recursive counting, various kinds of musics, recursive drumming, and those things that would have probably, converted us from, humanoid to, Homo sapiens. So there's a bit of a fancy footwork going on there. Yes, merge is unique to language. No, it's not quite unique to language. It's also unique to these other language-like things.
And if I think about it now, which other people might want to jump in, move would surely be the same. I can imagine things that are non-linguistic moving from one spot to the other. Why is that in any sense language specific? I've never understood why if we merge and move are language specific. They seem to be completely general cognitive operations. I can move things generally, I can merge things generally. Agree maybe. So I've always wondered about that.
See, I think so move is, let's just say, move and merge are kind of cousins, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like moving stuff around, like moving a chair. It's moving, it's creating a particular kind of representation where we have something in a set, and then we re-merge it or we put it somewhere else in the set, leaving a copy of itself. And there are particular constraints on that, so you can only merge or move into something that extends or you can merge something that extends the tree. You can't, move into structures that are already created. So they're actually very, very specific constraints on what you can do and what you can't do. And what I'm not seeing is, when I don't know, people, so ethologists are looking at, chimpanzee kinship patterns. I'm not seeing them say, well, there's, Bob scratched Joe's back, which shows some kind of a hierarchical thing. But what's really interesting is that Bob will only scratch the chimp's back that is at the root of the kinship thing, right? So like to extend the tree. I don't even know what that would mean when it comes to grooming behavior. We don't see similarly, so move is also implicated in island type, right? What you can't move out of is an island. So, again, I don't see the kind of research that says, in chimp grooming patterns, there are certain chimps that cannot be groomed because they are in a kinship island.
But you could link them to, for example, to Tomasello's notion of joint intentionality. I know that he knows that you know that I know. That kind of cognitive play, which is on a cognitive level, could be the basis, that kind of functional, could be the functional basis for the development of things like merge recursivity.
I just said the other way around. It's like merge and recursivity that allows that kind of theory of mind to occur. So which again, what you don't see is, when it's like, if I've got my theory of mind is like, I know that you know that I know kind of thing. Are there islands in that? So are there kinds of things that I cannot know about you because you happen to be in an island? So I know that you know that, but I actually don't know, right? So I don't know something that Turrell knows because Turrell's in a knowing that I know. You know, so if we want to make the claim that, you know, these things are domain general, then you have to provide that kind of evidence. But, you know, and we can see it in language, but we're not seeing it in grooming patterns. We're not seeing it in, you know, bonobo sexual behavior, or, you know, joint, you know, gaze, I don't know.
But it could be situated within the broader context of what makes human beings more generally cognitively more intelligent than bonobos and chimps. It needn't be, from that perspective at least, linguistically specific capabilities. We're just more clever than the apes.
But then you've got kind of gradient effects, right? So human beings who are a little less intelligent to not be able to do these things because it's a, you know. So there are human beings that might be like kind of, you know, they're cognitively challenged. You know, the case of Christopher, the linguistic savant is one. There's this guy, he can't tie his shoelaces in the morning and he has to live with permanent help because you know, he's autistic. No, he's not autistic, but he's got general cognitive impairment. But he's a linguistic genius. You know, he speaks something like 20 languages. Just to show that, you know, the ability to compute language is not related to general intelligence. I mean, so there's a lovely story about him. You must read, I think it's Neil Smith, if you guys are interested in, you know, of Christopher was invited to Dutch TV to give a little interview. And, you know, he had 2 weeks' notice, and he arrives on the interview set and proceeds to have the interview in Dutch, which he hadn't been exposed to ever. You know, not like, you know, very high-grade Dutch, but it was recognizably Dutch. And so he was asked, well, how did you learn this? He said, well, with a newspaper and a dictionary. How else do you learn language? Now, clearly this guy is you know, a language genius, but, you know, he doesn't have general cognitive ability.
How do you account for a language genius, given the fact that according to UG, everything should be pretty much the same? What counts for a language genius?
No, that is, language genes are intact and his general cognitive genes are not. Because if it's innate, or if it's separate to general cognitive ability, then you expect exactly that. If language is computed using general cognitive ability, you expect someone with, you know, impairment in analogy to not be able to compute language. Not the case. It follows from the latest position. I'm saying it does.
I'm not sure it does, but anyway.
Yeah. But I mean, we also, sorry, I mean, we also have other things, like say we have the biological ability to walk, but it doesn't mean we're all equally good at it. Or say run, right? Some people are doing better at running, even though we all have the same basic ability.
Well, yeah, I wanted to change gears and ask a methodological question of all sorts. So I'm putting myself in, I guess, the position of like the 1930s American structuralist linguist, very interested in like documenting the empirical minutiae of new languages, less interested in big picture questions. Is there something that an empiricist perspective or a nativist perspective can offer me that the other one cannot? So there's a question of documenting languages before they die off. And one of these viewpoints give us anything methodologically useful to aid in this. I don't know that there is an answer to this one. Put that out at the beginning.
Ideally, for documentation, you probably want some kind of standard, you'd like some kind of template, because that would make languages more comparable, which is a risky enterprise because you then tend to choose one that you're familiar with and impose that on the language, and there's a risk in that. But an empiricist would say, well, let's go and find the regularities and describe them. If they happen to be quite similar to other languages, then it's because people are people, they share a lot of similarities as people. The differences would be due to cultural practices that differ. But you're always going to approach that task with some assumptions, some prior knowledge of other languages, mainly that family. So there's a risk that it becomes very idiosyncratic if you adopt this approach in the strictest sense, and that you may need some creative extrapolation to to go beyond what you have observed in order to describe the grammar in full. So in that sense, you're probably going to borrow a bit from a prioristic categories and try to do a more comprehensive job than your data would allow.
I actually, which sides here, I actually think, having an empiricist kind of approach might have an advantage in that it would encourage you to collect large amounts of corpus data, because that is all there is. Whereas, if you're taking a very nativist position, you might end up in a maybe more descriptivist, traditional approach to language description, or you might end up with, one in forward, two in forwards, I don't know, depending on you have the luxury of having a description. I think it's a bit of it's a pseudo distinction, right? Because what I know of people who have described the languages is they collect all the data they can, regardless of their persuasion. Where I think it would be useful, I don't know if it'll be useful, the nativist position will be useful for the describer, or what the describer is doing will be useful for the nativist position. But there's a gap in a lot of existing grammars. And that is exactly around the issues of those things that have been discovered by linguistics in say late 20th century, those theoretical constructs, which are not necessarily reflected in grammars. So for instance, it is very useful to know if the verbal head moved to T or not. And to do that, you need to have adverbs of various kinds. Often it's quite hard to get that stuff in descriptive grammars. Also, it would be very useful to know if something like the coordinate structure constraint is a universal. And then we need the people doing descriptions to actually ask the question, right? To demonstrate that they've actually read the theory and be able to apply it. So, well, let's ask someone to try and violate the constraint just to see if it's possible. Because if it turned out that you could do it in Piraha, and everything is possible in Piraha, then that would be evidence against the position, right? And I think that would be actually very useful. So I would hope that people doing description would actually try and interrogate the thing, take the stronger position. The thing, look for the data that is hard, the data that will disprove you.
Perhaps on that note, it's interesting that you bring up Kapora. Well, in a sense, you did large amounts of data. And I was wondering what your take on the use of Kapora is in this. This is in a sense a repeated question, maybe, but for a nativist to claim that Kapora are useful above and beyond monotonic tuition,